Yes, I called it genocide because it become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian. And the evidence is mounting. It's different than it was last week. The more evidence is coming out of literally the horrible things that the Russians have done in Ukraine. And we're going to only learn more and more about the devastation. And we'll let the lawyers decide internationally whether or not it qualifies, but it sure seems that way to me.
Hello there, I'm Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Medusa's English Language Edition, and welcome back to another episode of The Naked Pravda. It's been a few weeks since we released a new show. Since my last broadcast, Russia's foreign ministry banned me indefinitely from visiting Russia. And then a few days later, I got COVID with the rest of my family, so that sucks. The COVID thing more immediately so, but I'm pretty bummed not to be able to go back to Russia again anytime soon. Like the rest of Medusa's staff, I had no imminent plans to vacation in Moscow, but now I can't even daydream about being there until, I don't know, the fall of Putinism, I guess. Oh well. On this week's episode of The Naked Pravda, I spoke to 4 experts about war atrocities in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Each guest gave in-depth answers to some very tricky questions, so you'll have a lot to chew on here. But first I want to say a little about how this show came together, because allegations of Russian atrocities in Ukraine, especially genocide, are a sensitive subject. I learned this firsthand a couple of weeks ago when I solicited recommendations on Twitter asking whom I should approach for this episode. I upset people because I said I wanted to frame the show as a debate between experts about whether the Russian military's actions in Ukraine constitute genocide. As you may know, I am not Ukrainian, I'm not Russian either, and the spectacle of some dude in New England announcing from his iPhone that he wanted to arbitrate whether Ukrainians are being subjected to the crime of crimes, that was offensive. I didn't mean it like that, but we'll talk plenty about intent later on this show. I am grateful to the 4 scholars who spoke to me for this episode, despite how clumsily I framed my initial question. To be clear, I am still interested in whether Russia's actions constitute genocide as it's understood legally and historically. And I think it's worth discussing the legal and political repercussions of that designation, or its absence. But this issue, both genocide as a concept and the atrocities now being committed against the people of Ukraine, that's too big to accommodate my original plan to debate the yes or no of it. That was a dumb idea. So what I ended up doing, once I was actually talking to experts who understand this subject, was to ask all 4 scholars a handful of broad questions about atrocities, war crimes, genocide, and how the world has handled these things in the past. I asked guests some overlapping questions, and in other cases, our conversations went off in other directions. As I said, this show is a long one, so it's divided into 3 main parts. Part 1, the legal terms used to designate mass violence and crimes in warfare, and genocide's special legacy. Part 2, how war crimes and genocide are prosecuted, establishing genocidal intent and upholding justice. And finally, Part 3, the politics of genocide allegations and the consequences of taking them seriously. So here's Part 1, the legal terms used to designate mass violence and crimes in warfare, and genocide's special legacy. When we talk about Russian war crimes in Ukraine, which are ongoing, obviously, is there a hierarchy of egregiousness with genocide, at the very top? Or is that not the perspective to take when discussing war crimes from a legal perspective, let's say?
From a legal perspective, no.
That's Erin Farrell Rosenberg, an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati's College of Law and an attorney specializing in international criminal law and reparations.
There is no hierarchy of crimes, but it's certainly true that a number of legal commentators, legal scholars, and people who talk about the law do see a hierarchy of crimes, which often carries some sort of different moral reasoning or values that go into terms of how it's structured. But from a purely, like, if you're asking me for the law itself, no, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, these are all international crimes that all equally shock the conscience of mankind, and they are different, and they have different harms. They are not worse or more grave one or the other.
So it's not like genocide is a more aggravated form of some lower crime.
No.
They all exist kind of horizontally.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what are there definable differences between a war atrocity and genocide, or is one a category of the other, or how does one distinguish between these in legal terms?
So that's a great question. So the legal term that we would use is the contextual elements, but I'll just basically describe what they are.
Okay.
So if you think about ordinary crimes, like any crime that in whatever country you might be, you would recognize: the crime of murder, assault, robbery, right? Property destruction.
Yeah.
What makes ordinary crimes international is the context in which they are committed, right? So, for example, if the crime of murder is committed on a widespread and systematic basis according to a state policy, then those individual murders can be a part of an attack on the civilian population, right? Of murder as a crime against humanity. So murder, you recognize, is just that can be prosecuted in your own country, right? When it's committed at this widespread, systematic basis as a part of a state policy, it becomes a crime against humanity. When you're in an armed conflict, that's the contextual element of war crimes. There are the Geneva Conventions set out, the conduct of hostilities, the laws of armed conflict. And so within an armed conflict, if you violate the Geneva Conventions, what's called a grave breach, that becomes a war crime. So, for example, killing a civilian, that's a war crime. Raping a civilian, killing someone or to combat, right, who has a combatant who has surrendered. These are war crimes. War crimes can only be committed in armed conflict, right? Crimes against humanity can occur in armed conflict or in peacetime. The crime of genocide can occur in peace or during war as well, so like crimes against humanity. And genocide is essentially where you have 5 different acts, which are called sort of the underlying acts. So you would have the either murder, prevention of births, causing severe mental harm, separating of children, that is being carried out against what's called a protected group, which means a group on the basis of their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion. And you're doing that act with a specific intent of physically destroying the group. So you're not, if you want to think about it, you're not necessarily looking at genocide as it's made up of individual acts, right? But those acts are really an attack on the group.
I see.
With the goal of destroying the group.
And when defining these protected groups, do the defining characteristics, do they have to be immutable? Is there a specific list? Like in the Ukrainian context, for it to be genocide, would Russia have to be targeting every single ethnic Ukrainian, or would it qualify to merely target people that call themselves Ukrainian, or people that wear a uniform or something like that? Like, how does, in terms of defining the group, what's the criteria exactly?
Well, that's a great question, and there's a lot of debates about all of this. So nationality would be, I think, the group that we would be thinking about in terms of Ukraine, right? This would be the destruction of a group on the basis of nationality and not necessarily ethnicity, right? So we wouldn't be thinking about Ukraine as an ethnicity, but rather as a nationality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's very little case law, to be quite frank about it, about what exactly that means. All of these, as you can imagine, when you actually start digging into them, are pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Because what we mean by race and ethnicity also changes over time.
Right.
And even when you think of when the Genocide Convention was created, or even if you think about how Jews were referred to by the Nazis, for example, right? Those were laws that are referred to as, right, race laws. So, and then it's sort of, well, Jews, and this is, of course, as someone who's Jewish, I can obviously talk about this a lot, but it's, it's a thing that is often raised. Is it an ethnicity? Is it a religion? Is it a race? And so this is actually becomes quite complicated as part of the Genocide Convention. I think that Russia, when we look at the way that Russia is speaking about as like the state is speaking, they're clearly speaking about the entity Ukraine as a state. And that is what the objection seems to be about. Interestingly, though, just to sort of point out on the other side, when you think about, because genocide has been such a part of this conversation all the way from 2014, right?
Yeah.
It's in 2014 where Russia alleges genocide was committed, right? And its allegation, which, by the way, has been found to have really zero credibility in each of the investigations that have looked at this. But what was their argument was that it was about ethnic Russians, or well, ethnically Russian Ukrainians, right? So from their perspective, they have presented this idea of a genocide against people who are ethnically Russian. And now the question is Russia actually committing genocide, or is there a risk that they're committing genocide against people on the basis of their Ukrainian nationality? So we really have all of these classifications kind of coming together in a really volatile situation, and I think creating a lot of confusion, to be honest.
Is there any precedent for a genocide against a nationality in the way that Ukrainians are defined in this conflict? Because the genocides I'm familiar with, or at least I think the layman is familiar with, are probably the more like racially defined groups. At least, like, I mean, the Jews were racially defined by the Nazis. In Rwanda, it was a tribal or racial conflict, as far as I understand it. Is that the bulk of precedent with race, or is that not the way genocide has worked in the past?
Well, certainly, if you mean in terms of the legal cases, yes, exactly, right? Because it's really, if we're talking about Rwanda, if we're talking about Srebrenica, if we're maybe discussing the more modern context of the Rohingya or the Uyghurs, where there's a question of whether or not genocide is happening, right? We're talking about either racial, religious, or ethnic targeting, right? So there isn't in terms of a court case, if you will, that you can point to that necessarily recently has to do with nationality, but it is a protected class. And I think that the closest example you would get would be some of the cases coming out of Poland post-World War II, which did consider what the Nazis did in terms of attempting to destroy the Polish national identity as genocidal.
And so it doesn't have to be that the aggressor seeks to exterminate every last member of a particular group. It's enough to target their state infrastructure and anybody who claims that identity. It can be more about ideas and institutions than literal destruction of every human being.
Well, it doesn't have to be literal destruction of every human being. And it's important to realize that what it's about is the intent, right? That you're doing one of these acts that I mentioned, right? Either murder, causing severe mental or physical harm to members of the group. You're imposing conditions of life that are meant to destroy the group. You're separating children, which is one of the things we're seeing, right? Ukrainian children being sent to Russia. But what the Genocide Convention itself provides is for destruction in whole or in part. So genocide itself, like the Genocide Convention itself, does not require full intent to destroy the entire group. And it certainly doesn't require that you actually do destroy the entire group.
Right.
But really what your intent is. It does need to be what's called in part, which has been interpreted to be significant enough to impact the group as a whole.
I put the same question about a hierarchy of horrors to Eugene Finkel, an associate professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and the author of the book Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust.
So technically, there shouldn't be any hierarchy of suffering, from a legal point of view. And there shouldn't be any hierarchy of suffering from a moral point. From a political point of view, of course, the story is very different. And there is a very clear hierarchy of suffering and of crimes, from war crimes to crimes against humanity to atrocity crimes, with the genocide being at the very top. And that's why calling it a genocide, brings so much attention. Had people come out and said, well, there are war crimes, so even atrocity crimes happening in Ukraine, well, I'm not sure we would be having this conversation right now. But precisely because genocide is such a sensitive topic that it draws so much attention. Genocide is a legal term, but it's also a political term, and it's an historical term, and it's a moral term, and we cannot separate one from another. And we do have separate conversations going on. Well, one is the legal conversation, whether it fits the definition of genocide, which is one definition from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948, and whether what we see in Ukraine will be enough to prosecute people for genocide, which is a much higher bar. And quite a few legal scholars, the most prominent is, of course, Philip Sands, saying, well, we shouldn't be using this term because the bar is so high that it's almost impossible to meet, so we shouldn't disappoint Ukrainians and their supporters by invoking the term. So there is a legal conversation going on, and it is important. But there is also another conversation that is going on among scholars of genocide, which are not bound, by this requirement of putting people in jail or prosecuting them and meeting the legal requirements. And that is a conversation that I'm engaged in, and this is the conversation in which politicians are being engaged, because they're also thinking less about, future accountability. But President Biden said that eventually the determination will be made by lawyers. It hasn't prevented him from calling it a genocide. And there is also a moral conversation and historical conversation. And it's pretty normal, because genocide is different things to different people. And it's important to understand that calling it a genocide does not necessarily mean that, people will be prosecuted for the crime of genocide, because different scholars apply different criteria and interested in different things.
So is the bar lower when making the political determination than saying the legal one? Or is it just that, what's the difference, I guess? Like, why is it more plausible to do it politically than legally?
I'm not sure the bar is lower. The bar is just different. From the legal point of view, you need to focus on individual perpetrations and their motivations. As historians, as social scientists, well, looking at the event as a whole,
right,
without thinking, well, whether this or that person should that or that Ukrainian civilian, whether we will have enough evidence to convict them, but rather looking at what's happening at the macro level. So I thought that the bar is lower, just different types of determination, different types of evidence.
So clearly there's a divide between the strictly legal definition of genocide and the meaning that most people grasp intuitively. Dirk Moses has written about this. He's a professor of global human rights history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the author of The Problems of Genocide, and the senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research.
Well, there are a number of problems. One is that there is, in terms of the international public's, if you want to use a term like that, appreciation of mass criminality, there is a hierarchy of criminality. With genocide at its apex, as the crime of crimes, is a term often used, and it's often in the subtitle of books on genocide. And that phrase will appear in many books on the subject. And it was invented by the person who coined the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin. He called it the crime of crimes. He wanted his crime to be the number one crime, the most shocking attack on human beings possible. The most heinous of crimes is also a term he used. But that's not the case in international law. There is no real hierarchy. Crimes against humanity for the International Criminal Court are not less grave than genocide. So there's that's one problem. Okay. Now, related to that problem is that in view of this hierarchy, which obtains also in politics and not just international public opinion, because they're related, people only seem to be shocked, genuinely shocked, when something can be called genocide. Mm-hmm. And, crimes against humanity somehow is less grave, which I think is itself kind of shocking. Okay, because the acts which constitute many crimes against humanity, because there are many elements or many different acts which can occur that can be classed as crimes against humanity, are about the same as genocide. The difference with genocide is that you have this special intent requirement, which is the destruction of an ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. With crimes against humanity, you just need to show that these were done and they were part of a widespread and systematic campaign. But the intention is irrelevant. They happen. So that's why it's much easier to prove crimes against humanity. And you'll find far more prosecutions for that than for genocide. And obviously more prosecutions for war crimes as well, much easier to prove. Not that any of them are easy to prove, but they're easier than genocide. Okay.
Right.
So there are these two problems. One is that there's this radical distinction between the legal and the political, and then there's this issue with this hierarchy, which is not a legal proposition; it's sort of a political one. Why that is the case is something that we could discuss. A lot of it got to do with Holocaust memory, I think.
Right.
And then there's the issue related to that question of hierarchy, is that crimes which, quote unquote, fall short or do not rise, which are terms that you hear all the time, to the level of genocide, are considered to be less grave when the impact on the civilian population is the same. Mm-hmm. So there are other problems of genocide, but those are two major ones, and they are coming up in this conflict in Ukraine, as well as other conflicts in world politics.
When speaking sort of in the way that politicians do, or just what public intellectuals, not in the sort of narrower legal sense, is it that people are just they're willing to accept more in terms of proving intent? I mean, are they still working with roughly the same definition? They're just kind of, the bar is lower for what counts as evidence?
I think the sensitization to mass criminality, which I admire, by the way, and applaud in international public opinion, is indexed to an understanding of genocide, which is much broader than the legal definition, okay, but is more accurate in terms of what the destruction of a group entails, okay? Mm-hmm. And it's much closer to the, if you like, original or first definition of genocide that Raphael Lemkin proposed in 1944 in a book about the Axis occupation of Europe. It's called Axis for an Occupied Europe, basically Nazis and its allies, right? Yeah. How did they occupy? He used that term because of various international legal conventions, especially the Hague Convention about the laws of occupation, right? How did they conduct their occupations after the conquest of Europe? Mm-hmm. And that's not just the Germans, but also their allies. And he identified the destruction of nations, for example, the Polish nation, the Jewish people, and so forth, as a new form of occupation, which he called genocide. Mm-hmm. And that hadn't been criminalized in international law at the time, which did regulate the way states conducted themselves. This is in the Hague Convention of 1899, 1907, and did protect individuals, in the occupied population. But it didn't proscribe the destruction of, entire nations, ethnic groups, and so forth, the religions. Mm-hmm. And that's why he invented this concept, in order to propose an an augmentation of international law.
Is this where we get ideas of like the soul of a nation, and it's somewhat abstract, but it certainly resonates, broadly.
Yeah. So in the interwar period, which was a period of enormous nationalism, the nationalists and nationalist movements believed in propositions that today we may not. They would say the Polish nation or the Ukrainian nation has a spirit or a soul, and that today we would say national culture or something. Okay,
sure. Civic.
It's a very romantic notion of nationalism, and that the bearers of this national spirit or soul are school teachers, intellectuals, the bureaucracy. Those are the nation-bearing strata of a population. So Lemkin thought that, like many, that the building blocks of humanity were ethnic, racial, and religious groups, especially national groups. And that people's foremost identities were that as members of a nation, and that everything flowed from that. So that needed to be the protected group, rather than civilians as such, which is what the Geneva Conventions aim to protect. Okay, it's a different way of approaching protecting civilians. Lemkin was interested in protecting civilians, but only certain categories of civilians. Okay, and that's why victims of genocide, or people who are claiming they're victims of genocide, are national groups, or people who are speaking on behalf of national groups. Right? Well, it can't be doubted that the empirical evidence suggests, for example, in the case in Ukraine, is that that we have read many statements by political leaders and in the Russian public sphere, where they aim to de-Ukrainize Ukraine, to destroy the nation. Okay. Now, however, the problem legally, and this is something that your other speakers may address, is that nationality as such is not protected in the Genocide Convention. Human lives are protected. It's only genocidal if individuals who are perceived as being members of a particular targeted group are killed because they're or persecuted with life-threatening consequences for being members of that ethnic or national or religious group. But the idea of a nationality, a national spirit is not something the Genocide Convention gestures to, because it dropped the notion of cultural genocide.
I see.
For the convention, the idea is that a perpetrator is guilty of genocide if his or her intention is to destroy an ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And then, then the convention lists 5 ways of doing that, right? And each of those 5 ways pertains to the treatment of individuals for being members of that group. Okay? So it's an ascription of identity.
Okay. And in Ukraine now, what we're seeing doesn't quite meet that narrow definition. Is that what you're saying, or?
Well, we don't know yet.
Sure.
It's really early days. In order to, first of all, I have to say here make clear to your readers or listeners that I'm not a lawyer. Okay. And so these technical things need to really be answered by the lawyers. But from the reading I've done, states are not guilty of genocide. Individuals are. Okay. According to the Rome Statute and so forth. So you need to be able to identify particular individuals who gave orders, and this will be in the context of a military campaign. Okay?
I see.
To attack civilians solely because they are members of the Ukrainian people, with the intention to destroy them solely because they're members of Ukrainian people,
right?
And because they may be combatants, or maybe partisans, or maybe in the way of shelling against human shields, as it were, in the way because they were next to a military objective. Once military objectives sort of muddy the waters, then proving this pure special intent is very difficult. And that's one reason we see so few prosecutions for genocide.
Now, so one thing I'm trying to wrap my head around here is that it seems as though what you've told me is that Raphael Lemkin, that his original concept of genocide was more expansive than the one that was ultimately adopted.
Yes.
But he also had a sort of old-fashioned understanding of what defines a protected group. So in some, it's almost as though some aspects of the original genocide definition were more expansive and closer to what we are familiar with as sort of ordinary people today. But there's also this aspect to it that doesn't really, it doesn't reconcile as easily with modern day notions.
Correct.
Okay.
I think that
right.
it is complicated. I mean, Lumpkin is a really interesting figure.
Sure, and we're all products of our times. And all
but
that,
it's an ambiguous legacy. I mean, there's no doubt the Nazis did target Jews and other groups. They thought for security reasons in their own paranoid world, right?
Right.
But there's no doubt that throughout history in the 20th century, various groups, national, racial, religious, but also class and other groups, have been targeted for destruction by states. Okay. The problem with the Genocide Convention is not only that the list of protected groups is so narrow, it excludes class groups, for example, or it makes it very difficult to prove genocide, for example, in the Cambodian case, because it's one's own government that's doing this. So some people use the term auto-genocide, right? But the issue is in the convention, it talks about destruction of a group as such. This as such adds a qualification, which makes it very difficult to prove in legal terms. And that's something very, very different, I think, from the way the public understands these things. So what it means is that the targeted group is attacked with an attempt to destroy it, not because some of its members may have been engaged in an insurgency, but solely on the grounds of identity, like as a massive hate crime. But that's not how most military encounters or, counterinsurgencies and so forth, attacks on civilians take place. They take place in the context of some kind of military or armed conflict. And the Genocide Convention really has little room for that.
For another perspective on the differences between the legal and political understandings of war crimes and genocide, I turned to Dr. Maria Varaki, a lecturer in international law at the War Studies Department at King's College London and the co-director of the War Crimes Research Group.
What we have experienced during the last months, we have seen this type of paradox, if I can call it, especially between political leaders, the language the political leaders use about the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We had it already and the language we lawyers use, to put it simply like that. So we already saw President Biden from the very beginning characterizing Putin as a war criminal, right? And later there were other political leaders who started talking about this is genocide. This is genocide. That put an onus on legal experts, to explain to the public the differences and also to highlight that it's a different thing to call it genocide in the public discourse, but it has different implications when we describe legally a particular atrocity, whether it's a war crime, a crimes against humanity, or genocide. Yes, it's true that we say that there is no an official hierarchy between the different crimes. However, genocide is a very particular crime because it requires, legally speaking, you need to prove that there is a particular intent. As we say, there is genocidal intent.
Right.
So the perpetrators we have to prove that the perpetrators carry this particular intent to destroy, in part or in total, a group of people based on national, ethnical, racial, or religious characteristic, a religious group.
Is there any legal understanding or definition of what in part means? Because that sounds really vague.
Yeah, we have jurisprudence coming from this ad hoc tribunal for Rwanda in particular, where there it was a clear case of genocide where the court, and it was a big challenge, for the judges and for the lawyers of that before that court to understand, to interpret this meaning. So it requires some element number, a quantitative element, but, it's not a matter of saying, I have 200 and this is genocide, 200 victims. But if I have 150, it's not a genocide. It depends very much on the other factors. It depends very much on the context. And this is why I say that we don't have one solution that fits everything. We have seen that in cases now. For example, before the ICTY, the Special Tribunal, the Ad Hoc Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, several states and people talked about genocide, and still, legally speaking, genocide was only declared in the case of Srebrenica. okay, where you had 8,000 Muslim men and boys, but nowhere else in former Yugoslavia.
Because of intent, because of what they could prove with intent?
Because they could prove the intent. It was the 8,000 Muslim men and boys were executed. They could prove this particular intent. And it's very difficult to infer. I mean, sometimes you can have direct evidence, but most of the time you need to infer it indirectly, okay, indirectly. And as we speak, leaders and people, who are involved in those atrocities become smarter and smarter, try to slip away. However, we have new technologies, and that helps a lot as well. And we have seen that in cases like, for example, before the International Court of Justice, we have the case of Myanmar now, where a state is accused, for the crime of genocide. And their satellite images helped a lot. The same applies in the case of Ukraine now. We have all these new tools of technology, satellite images, drone footages, interception of services, of security. I mean, it's fascinating, but it gives us more tools. That doesn't mean that it's not difficult. It's very difficult to prove this genocidal intent, the particular intent that you want to destroy a particular group.
Part 2 of today's episode: How war crimes and genocide are prosecuted, establishing genocidal intent, and upholding justice. My first question here went to Professor Rosenberg. When determining genocidal intent, what's admissible in terms of making that determination? Like, is it strictly state rhetoric? Is it strictly the speeches of leaders, or like intercepted communications between the actual perpetrators of the violence? Or is it accepted that you can also go into like the state propaganda and pull from that and say, well, this proves something? Because I've seen some studies that argue that the Kremlin propaganda today, that some of their rhetoric against essentially denying Ukrainian statehood and so on, that belongs in the discussion about a potential genocide occurring in Ukraine now.
Yes, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think that everything that you've identified is definitely relevant. And one of the things I would just say is that, any crime where you have to establish intent is always going to be complicated from a legal perspective, right? If you ever watch like a police procedural or one of these like courtroom procedurals, they'll have these conversations of, we have to prove that they meant to shoot the guy. And like,
right.
It's not enough to just show, and that's just a regular part of the law that, how you prove intent is difficult. It's often not based on sort of, the smoking gun of you've got the plan that says, we are going to commit genocide against X people, right? That's not the way that it usually goes. So usually you have to either infer that there was a policy, be able to, establish that there was a policy, or you can infer genocidal intent from conduct. But it really has to be quite clear, right? That is the only reasonable conclusion that can be drawn if you don't have concrete, direct evidence of genocidal intent. So the things that you look at, as you've said, yes, hate speech, and maybe to not sort of just list things, but to kind of explain what you're looking for. If you think about what are the different factors which create an environment that's really conducive to a situation devolving into genocide. Right. Those are going to be your indicators of genocidal intent.
And is it your impression that we're seeing those signals from Russia now?
Very much so. Though I would say that I don't view them primarily from a question of whether I think genocidal intent is being established. I view them as very serious risk indicators of a potential genocide.
I see.
And I think that they are definitely present right now. And that the messaging being sent to, maybe to take a step away from genocide for a moment, but the messaging being sent to Russian soldiers more broadly is a message of tolerance of atrocity crimes generally, and that the type of language, dehumanizing language used against Ukrainians, the denial of even sort of an identity of being Ukrainian, the just constant hate speech that's being aired, this really encourages not just a risk of genocide, but all types of war crimes and atrocities being committed against Ukrainian people. In terms of the risk of genocide itself, which I do believe exists in Ukraine, I think that the international community, the United Nations, really every country should just be hammering as a talking point and insisting to Russia that it must stop the broadcast of this constant hate speech, that this really needs to be said in a much more intense and repeated much more, because I feel like it's not being stressed enough how very volatile this situation is. And it's really important that this kind of language that just festers hate and leads to a tolerance of violence not be allowed to just continue to be pumped into the airways.
Specifically for the domestic audience, you're saying? For
the domestic audience, I mean, again, this is about preventing something from happening.
Yeah.
And, it's for, any soldier who might get called up and sent to Ukraine next week. And, it's just simply, it is very, very dangerous to have this kind of language being spread across state media at a time when the Ukrainian people are very, very vulnerable. And I really just think it needs to be a priority of everyone to insist that it stop now.
Is there a precedent for focusing on state messaging or state broadcasting in the sense that you're describing, or is that what you're proposing is a sort of novel approach?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's novel, but I would say, look at, for example, Myanmar, and look at what happened with the Rohingya. After the fact, right now we have one of the largest lawsuits being filed by Rohingya against Facebook for what? For allowing, just simply allowing the propagation, the continued just spewing of hate speech, which led to what? Which led to genocide. And Facebook just didn't do enough to stop it, right? And so I think it's not so much that whether it's novel, but it's a regular feature of sort of like the warning signs, right? So we know this, so why not address it?
Dr. Veraki also explained how genocidal intent is established legally and how the term can be used politically as well.
You need to show, that there is a particular, I would say, a policy. Some people try to replace also intent with a particular genocidal policy. It's not like random people. For example, in Rwanda, from the radio, and we had a case before the ICT, there were statements, broadcasters calling, go and track down the cockroaches. The cockroaches, it was a very clear message, to start the genocide. In other cases, you may have even papers. The old times, the old good times. You could have the state policies, documenting.
Right.
Okay. Nowadays, that's why I'm saying I'm talking about interception. I'm talking about other types of technologies and tools. There could be documents, but also you can try to infer that from patterns, from statements, from behaviors, from inaction, from indirect encouragement, from indirect endorsement of particular policies, for many, many things. And I think what happened in Ukraine, and this is where I see why some people claim that there could be elements of genocide, is that there were elements, that the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian nation does not exist, but even if it exists, they are Nazis. Okay, and we have a name to denazify Ukraine, and these people, because they are Nazis, they must be, I cannot use the language, not exterminated, but, we show from testimonies from victims that when Russian soldiers committed different type of atrocities, they were particularly cruel because in their mind, they were so indoctrinated that the Ukrainians, were not people worth of living, because they were all Nazis, if you see what I mean, So this is my understanding when some legal experts or I would say mainly journalists and others talk about genocide. But I would just highlight that we must be very, very careful. It remains to be seen. Now, with Ukraine, I would say that it's more complicated. I don't think they want, I think it would be, unless there is evidence that I don't know, I don't personally know, that there is a particular evidence that there is an intent that you want to destroy the Ukrainians as a nation. Okay. But here it's more complicated even because the Russian official propaganda is that there is no Ukrainian nation. Do you see what I mean? We're all the same nation. Why should they exist as a separate sovereign state? They're not a separate nation. So it's kind of contradictory over there. I would say that, and that's why maybe we'll be surprised. That's why at this stage, based on the evidence we have now, and the evidence the investigative teams on the ground collect, we talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity. I think the threshold of genocide is very, very high to be reached. And as I say, from my understanding until now, unless there is something I totally miss, I have to be very, very clear, and unless there is this particular evidence, I think it's very difficult now to talk about genocide. I want to say one more thing. We have proceedings before the International Court of Justice from the very beginning of this conflict where Ukraine asked the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to order provisional measures against Russia to stop the military invasion, because what did Russia claim? One of the arguments was, that there is genocide taking place in eastern Ukraine. That's why we intervened to rescue the Russian-speaking population, okay? So the court at that time said, we don't have evidence of genocidal acts on behalf of the Ukrainian state, okay? Ukraine, apart from asking the court to order Russia to stop the military invasion, also kind of asked the court to determine that genocide takes place on behalf of Russia. I think this is very, very unlikely. If we go into the proceedings, into the real proceedings later, it's something that remains to be seen parallelly with proceedings before national fora or international fora. But I would say that the usage of genocide is mainly for political purposes, because it carries this massive semiotics and symbolism. And it triggers sensitive reaction, you understand, emotional reaction.
Right.
There is no state that wants to be accused of having committed genocide. Look at modern Turkey nowadays and the Armenian genocide. Okay. So there is something like that. So if you say that a state is responsible for genocidal policies, immediately, this state will say, no. Like, look at Myanmar. No, we didn't do anything with the Rohingya. Okay. And we didn't persecute this particular group. However, we see that politicians use it again and again because it triggers, it's a linguistic propaganda. It's a tool, they use that.
Professor Finkel warned me that it can be dangerous to rely on legislators for designations in this field. Are there any problems that you see with relying on governments as opposed to judicial bodies to reach this designation? I mean, because say the Congress or the president isn't necessarily equipped to accuse people of criminal activity.
Right. So I'm honestly quite critical of politicians legislating on those topics. I was perfectly fine with President Biden, making this determination. What I'm less fine with is legislate those things. And to be honest, that's what quite a few East European and also not East European parliaments did. Not just now, but even in previous instances of mass violence.
So what's an example of this?
So, for instance, the Holodomor, which has been legislated as genocide in Ukraine, and I'm very critical about this because it prevents any meaningful debate. And even if more evidence comes out and the perspective does change, as long as it's in the books, then it would have any practical effects. In fact, it bounds the hands of historians in a way that it shouldn't. And it's, again, not to single out Ukraine, it's also true for Poland in the case of Katynia, for Azerbaijan in the case of Antalya massacre, for the Baltic states in the case of deportations of local populations by the Soviets. So that's actually quite widespread.
Mhm.
So I'm finding politicians calling a spade a spade. I'm very critical of legislative bodies putting it down on paper as the law of the land.
I see.
That's not their job.
In your opinion, and I know this isn't the top priority necessarily, but as somebody who is a Russia studies person, one question I have when having this conversation about designating Russian war crimes in Ukraine, possibly genocide, what do you think the best approach is to convince, in terms of adjudication, that would leave the most Russians convinced that these war crimes or this genocide did indeed happen? Like if President Biden going on the news and saying that's genocide will likely not convince many Russians that their troops have committed atrocities in Ukraine. Are there other procedures that could have more of an effect on the hearts and minds of Russians?
I think it depends on the time frame. In the right now or in the foreseeable future, no, I don't think anything would convince the Russian public that what is going on, not even genocide, but war crimes against humanity more general.
Yeah.
In the longer term, if we get to the point where we can talk freely about history in Russia and about the war in Russia, then probably the most effective way to do it would be through public education and through curriculum in schools, maybe legal accountability of people perpetrated those crimes, and Ukraine does that. But that also first and foremost needs to be an internal Russian conversation, right? We can't convince them from the outside. That's just not how things work. That's not how it works in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And Germany is the best case of a nation accepting its responsibility. Their attempts to force the determination or them from the outside backfired.
Mm-hmm. So using Germany as an example, if that's it's hard. It sounds wrong to say if Nazi Germany is a best case scenario, but if what happened there is a model for what could be hoped for in terms of Russian public perceptions, how would that play out? Like Russia would be, destroyed, or how exactly would it work?
Well, so maybe not Nazi Germany, but post-Nazi Germany.
Right.
Would certainly be a good scenario. Now, where the Russia needs to be destroyed, it's not for me.
Sure.
I have no impact on that, and I don't know what it means in practice.
Yeah.
But in terms of what it would require, yes, I think it would require changing internal conversations, so teaching, accepting responsibility.
Right.
Apologizing, talking about that openly in schools, in public culture, holding trials. And it takes decades.
Yeah.
It doesn't, its own process.
One of the key components to determining, as I understand it, to determining genocide and possibly other war atrocities has to do with the intent of the aggressor, of the perpetrator. What is admissible, either in a legal sense or in a political sense, when it comes to determining the intent of, say, the Russian military in Ukraine?
Right. So again, we're having two different conversations here,
Right,
and I'm
right.
less qualified to talk about what will be admissible in the court of law, but we will certainly need to. What we will need to have to establish intent is, of course, to show that it does exist, and I think we clearly have established that on the state level, with the rhetoric that is coming out of Moscow, that is all over the Russian state media, that is also in statements by public officials like Medvedev or even Putin, that Ukrainians are not real people, that Ukrainian identity is a fake, that the state is a fake. When you combine it, when you take it together, we certainly have this intent at the state level. We have this violence on the ground. The key is to connect those, either at the global level, so to show that both individual perpetrators or the military or the Rosgvardia Modelli were actually affected by this intent, that there is a connection between violence and the rhetoric. And that's what I think we still do not have. So people who argue that it is a genocide myself included. We take this analytical leap of faith that, that we assume that this rhetoric does affect people on the ground, and we have pretty decent evidence to suggest that it does. But it's not full, and it will, and we will need more of that. Especially when if we want to hold individuals accountable. We need to show that this intent existed in each individual case, that the soldier or the officer gave an order and pulled the trigger. They were affected by this propaganda and acted within this intent, which again, from the legal point of view, is much harder to do than to say that there is general, orders given to the military on how soldiers talk to the victims. That we do have, but that's not certainly not enough to put individuals on trial, at least as of now.
So in terms of media messaging, where there is a lot of this rhetoric about essentially denying the legitimacy of Ukrainian statehood, in terms of making connections to soldiers' activity in the aggregate, are you then basically looking at like media reports where they're interviewing the victims or the eyewitnesses to massacres, and soldiers are saying things that sort of echo what are said in the state media? Is that that's the logical connection?
For instance, yeah. So, and we had some instances of people of Russians, again, as reported by the victims, when Russian soldiers used violence against Ukrainians, they justified by what is being written in Komsomolskaya Pravda and other newspapers. So that would be type of evidence. All intercepted calls, which Ukrainian security services are doing a wonderful job intercepting and posting online, where they talk about their goals to kill Ukrainians as such, without any distinction. So that would be a type of evidence. Maybe some documents that will get captured, maybe documents, but mostly for now we rely on those intercepted calls and victims' reports.
Returning to Dr. Veraki, I asked her about successes and failures in national attempts to reconcile with past genocides and atrocities. For instance, what about Germany and the Holocaust, and Turkey and the Armenian genocide?
That's a very difficult question, because you compare Germany, post-World War Germany, and Turkey, and you see that. I can give you another example from former Yugoslavia, Serbia, for example. They haven't accepted it. It's a stigma. It is a stigma at the end of the day. As I said before, you cannot find any state that is proud of being accused, of having committed genocide. It is a stigma, and all states, deny that, and they try, to oppose those claims. Now, when it comes to issues of reconciliation, if I understood correctly a little bit this issue, I think it becomes very problematic, especially in our case when we talk about Ukraine and Russia. We're talking about people who have common relatives, okay? They're people who are living in one country, and they have the brothers and sisters are in the other country. I think the damage on the social institution of both societies is massive. It would require generations. The people have suffered so much. How can you forgive? It becomes very, very difficult. Imagine a child who has lost both his parents. This is something that we haven't realized because it's an ongoing conflict for 3 months now. But I'm petrified thinking about that. And we are talking about two massive countries as well.
Right. In terms of the formal legal bodies and national or international institutions, who or what is best suited to carry out the designation of genocide or to say it doesn't qualify? I know that the Ukrainian Attorney General has so many thousands of allegations that it's working through, and it's named a few Russian soldiers that it's going to charge. Is that typically how these things are handled, or is it an international body? Or I know that you've mentioned they've invited the ICJ.
Yeah.
So there is an international involvement here. How does this sort of thing handle?
Yeah, I think there is a hyperactivity. This is how I teach it, of international institutions and international lawyers during the last 3 months. Of course, as I keep saying, we international lawyers, we thrive in crisis. It's an ontological issue for us. we have some unprecedented phenomenon going on. So for the first time, you have an ongoing conflict, and from the very beginning of this conflict, you have a parallel activation of proceedings, as I say, whether it's the ICJ and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, where the prosecutor of the ICC opened an investigation almost immediately. Okay, opened an investigation almost immediately. Yesterday, he made a statement that he has 42 people on the ground in Ukraine collecting evidence with massive financial and expertise, technical support by many countries. So Netherlands seconded forensic experts to the ICC. France did the same. The US did the same. There's financial support. So there is an unprecedented, I would say, coordinated effort, something we haven't seen in other conflicts, to put it simply like that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that can be discussed, why this conflict is so different from other conflicts. Now, today, the Ukrainians themselves started a war crime trial. It's the first Russian soldier, 21-year-old boy, is put on trial for having deliberately killed a civilian, a 62-year-old civilian. Now, what we call here, it's a small fish. Okay, so you see, he's tried and prosecuted for a war crime. I follow a lot the Ukrainian general prosecutors. He has said we have identified 11,000 cases, more or less, of war crimes, and we have arrested about 40 people, 40 Russian soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we are going to see is that we're going to see many different trials before national forum, not only Ukraine. I would say that we may see that in other countries where they activate what we call universal jurisdiction. So Germany has done that, France has done that, Ireland has done that. And then for the most serious crimes, the ICC kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that the Ukrainians, despite all this assistance they have been received during the last 3 months, they have the capacity. Maybe we will see that, to prosecute that high level of the most serious crimes.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest, my understanding is that it would be more. I don't want to use the word efficient, but I would say it would make more sense in many levels to have the big fish or the more serious crimes before an international tribunal. And we have an international tribunal. We have the ICC. So when it comes to war crimes, crimes against humanity, we have the court, the ICC, the International Permanent Court. Now, when it comes to the crime of aggression, for me, that's the most interesting crime, to be honest, between you and me in this particular conflict, waging an aggressive war.
Why is that?
Because what happened in Ukraine, it's an illegal invasion and flagrant violation of international law. It's an aggressive war that cannot be justified under the UN Charter or anything. So we have the crime of aggression, which is a leadership crime in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
Mm-hmm.
But based on the jurisdictional structure of the crime of aggression, the prosecutor of the ICC cannot investigate the crime of aggression for Russian leaders because Russia is not the state party to the Rome Statute.
Mm-hmm.
The prosecutor can investigate war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, but not the crime of aggression. And that's why, for me, since we have the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute during the last 2 years, for me, this is the most interesting thing, because that's why some experts here in UK, such as Professor Philip Sands and others, they propose a separate tribunal, a special tribunal just for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. Now, I see why they propose, and for me, this is the really key issue. But again, I think I believe, realistically speaking, that it's not so easy to be substantiated to fulfill that. But I see why, because in 2022, in the 21st century, waging an aggressive war should not be acceptable. Because if we didn't have the war, we wouldn't have
The rest
all
of it.
the other atrocities.
Right.
And that's why the crime of aggression is considered to be the supreme crime. You initiate an aggressive war, and then you start having war crimes and all the other atrocities that we discussed until now.
Part 3 of today's episode, the politics of genocide allegations and the consequences of taking them seriously. Once again, I turned first to Professor Rosenberg. Do you think is it more important for the public to be focused on atrocities as a concept, or is the compulsion to rise to a genocide conversation? Because at least, I know we started off saying that legally there's no hierarchy, but in terms of kind of public discourse, genocide does kind of galvanize more than any other word, it seems. Would you say that, is it right that the public kind of goes toward the genocide conversation because it mobilizes people the best? Or would it be a more honest or more accurate public conversation to keep it centered on the notion of atrocities?
Let me put it this way. I think that the Ukrainian people are at extraordinary risk. They have already suffered a huge number of violations.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think that from a Ukrainian perspective, what matters the most is how do you galvanize support to end this, right? So my view, I want to be very sensitive to that I understand that, what needs to be said in order to get people to care about this when you're really, risking losing your life it's not an academic debate.
Yeah.
But I would also say that for me, everything that we are seeing happening, these are horrifying acts that in their own right, irrespective of whether or not they amount to genocide or whether or not there is a risk to genocide, cause irreparable harm and damage to people. We are seeing reports of sexual violence being carried out. Sexual violence, and particularly in the manner that it is being reported as having been carried out in Ukraine, it doesn't need to be anything other than that to be a really life-altering, incredibly traumatic, difficult experience to recover from. So I think we need to be aware that there is a risk, and I do believe this, there is a serious risk of the situation devolving into a potential genocide. I also believe that there are ongoing atrocities happening now, and that the urgency has to be to care as much about stopping that as anything else.
What are the groups or institutions or bodies out there that are, in your opinion, best equipped to adjudicate these questions? Obviously, while the conflict is ongoing, it's very difficult to even get access to the sites where these crimes are being committed. I'd be interested to know, how do you assess a combatant's ability to adjudicate these questions in the middle of a war, and then what other institutions out there in the world handle these sorts of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the major things that we're seeing that, at least to me, seems fairly obvious is whether we look at the history of Chechnya, whether we look at Syria, what we're seeing play out in Ukraine involves obviously direct perpetrators, right? The Russians are who's committing the crimes, but there's also a very serious issue around command responsibility and just what appears to be a real failure to enforce the laws of armed conflict, to or any type of punishment when there's violations. So some of the people responsible are not necessarily, or who should be held ultimately responsible, are not necessarily in Ukraine.
Right.
They're really high level people. But for right now, I think that one, I would say, following the lead of Ukraine is what the international community needs to do. I really think it's important, whether we're speaking diplomatically, whether we're speaking, sort of from a thinking what might be like an off-ramp kind of peace settlement situation, but also because the conflict is still ongoing in terms of justice, that Ukraine's lead needs to be followed, because justice during conflict, the threat of justice is oftentimes suggested to be a deterrent, meaning you, commander in the field, if you hear that, there's investigators, you're going to shape up and not commit crimes, right? Because you don't want to get arrested. That's a theory of how this works. Another theory is that, in fact, it actually prolongs conflict, because it really becomes sort of the only way you evade justice is by winning.
I imagine. Yeah.
Yes. So in that sense, that's why I think that is just, and right now, because there is an ongoing conflict, that the steps that Ukraine takes is what the international community should support, but not go beyond that, because it's a very delicate situation.
And what does that mean exactly to follow Ukraine's lead? Does that mean that when the Attorney General of Ukraine, for instance, presses charges against a Russian soldier, the Ukraine's allies then do what exactly?
Well, I think that Ukraine is working, both domestically, but also bilaterally and multilaterally. So those are sort of case specific of what type of assistance Ukraine might need or might request.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I think in terms of complementarity with the ICC, that Ukraine is quite clear about kind of, what they're doing and what they might need assistance from in terms of investigations with the International Criminal Court.
I see.
It's important to remember, that it's Ukraine, it's Ukraine, not anybody else, who filed the declaration granting the ICC jurisdiction to begin with, right? So the ICC is investigating this situation at the behest of Ukraine. And I think it's really important that we always remember that it's not the international community or these, other countries that said, we're sending this international organization to Ukraine. It's actually Ukraine that has stepped up in so many different fora and embraced the rule of law and insisted upon the rule of law being carried out. And that's a very powerful thing to see take place in real time. And as someone both who's, a lawyer, but also, from a older democracy than Ukraine, I guess I would say that it is very humbling as well to realize that the weight that they give to the rule of law.
When sifting through this evidence, when adjudicating the allegations of war crimes, do you think, is there one approach that stands out among others that you think would actually win over more hearts and minds among Russians? Or this is hardly the priority, I certainly realize, but, I guess it would be nice if this process actually, if it changed some minds in Russia, where the invasion is obviously less controversial than many in the West would like it to be. Is there any precedent for handling these crimes in a certain way that the perpetrating side is more receptive to?
That's a great question. And what I would say is that criminal law is not well suited and doesn't really have the tools for what you're thinking of. But there is the field of law, transitional justice, that can be brought in and sort of built around, and criminal law then becomes just one part of it. And so when you are at the thinking about justice, it's not just criminal, right? It's not just the sort of criminal accountability, but you're also thinking about how can we do establishing the truth, which may take lots of forms that have nothing to do with the criminal prosecution. You know what I mean? There are various peace and reconciliation activities that can take place, as well as, quite frankly, thinking about types of institutional reforms and changes that maybe have come to light in terms of, as you pointed out, like some of the media issues that are perhaps inhibiting Russian people from understanding what is happening. But ultimately, criminal law and criminal prosecutions as a form of kind of getting the prosecuted side to be happy that they were, not happy, I suppose, but happy with the process, or
right.
That's not it's a very unlikely thing to have happen. I don't mean to be super cynical about this, but it's just really not the goal of criminal law. And it's why there has to be much more built around this than just simply a criminal case, because you're exactly right. I mean, the people of Russia, they have to be able to come back into the international community and we have to find a way to tell the story and establish a truth of what's happened, so that there isn't denialism, and that there can be healing, and that there can be hopefully some type of understanding.
In more ways than one, An ugly aspect to prosecuting war crimes and atrocities is counting the bodies. I asked Professor Finkel how this works with allegations of genocide. Does the number of victims in these crimes have any bearing on whether on the nature of their atrocity, or is it entirely intent? Like if you can find rhetoric saying that they're being killed specifically for being Ukrainian or for fighting for Ukraine, does that shoot them straight to the top of atrocity, whether even if it's 2 people versus 2 million? I mean, like, how do numbers play into this?
Right. So that's one of the trickiest gray zones of this discussion, because nobody knows what the numbers are.
Right.
What the convention requires, actions taken with the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part,
Right.
but nobody told us what in part means. Later determination, like in the case of Srebrenica, well, the ICTI determined that it needs to be substantial numbers without specifying what those substantial numbers are. In the case of Srebrenica, it was 7,000 to 8,000 people.
I see.
I think unfortunately, we will easily meet those numbers in the case of Ukraine.
Right.
But 1 or 2 people, no, I wouldn't dare, to come out and say genocide unless we were talking about thousands of people.
Right. In terms of what you're reading in the media, are you finding, I'm trying to kind of understand the nature of the potential genocidal intent on the part of the Russian authorities and the Russian troops. Is it like the extermination of Ukrainians as a people, or are they targeting actual combatants? Because my impression is a lot of the eyewitness reports are that there's certainly a lot of wanton violence at just drunken soldiers raping and pillaging, and it's absolutely horrible. But in terms of targeting, it seems like a lot of it is they're looking for evidence that someone was a combatant. And in that case, is it national extermination if they're going after enemy combatants?
So they're doing much more than that. You're absolutely right. There is a lot of random or indiscriminate violence. That wouldn't be enough. Mm-hmm. For determination of genocide. What genocide requires is a deliberate targeting, right. And we do have evidence of that. So not just combatants, but we have evidence that they're explicitly targeting people associated with Ukrainian national identity of the Ukrainian state. So not just soldiers, but former soldiers and their families, right. State officials and their families, veterans and their families. Mm-hmm. So the genocide is a crime against civilians. And that we do see within all this phantom violence that you described. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of background violence, which is indiscriminate, but within it, there is quite a lot of very targeted violence that is going on.
Has there been any evolution in terms of what is considered a protected group that if targeted qualifies as either genocide or a heightened form of war atrocity? Because I know my impression is that initially after World War II, it was defined in terms that would be considered too narrow today.
Yes, and that's another problem of the convention there for protected groups, ethnic groups, national groups, religious groups, or racial groups. That's certainly not enough, and there is absolutely no reason why, say, gender groups or age groups or especially political groups should not be part of the convention. That's clearly a problem. The convention leaves too many groups out. But in this case, there is a clear targeting of national, not ethnic groups, because many people who are targeting are ethnically Russians or Jews or Tatars, but a clear attempt to destroy a Ukrainian national group, a national identity.
Many, probably most people in the West are shocked and outraged by the Russian military's actions in Ukraine. There's public pressure to condemn these atrocities in the strongest possible language, which likely means calling it genocide, as Biden has done in the United States. But the West's hands aren't exactly clean either, whether we're talking about history or the modern day. I asked Professor Moses what this means for the West's capacity to hold Russia accountable. One of the threads that I've noticed in conversations about recognizing genocide in Ukraine or really anywhere is that the states that are in a position to recognize it and then potentially act on it, there are these consequences of reaching that designation. On one hand, I'm not sure about legally, but at least sort of morally and politically, it then compels some kind of action, whether it's prevention or prevention of further genocide or punishing the aggressor or something like that. And then on the other hand, and this seems like it was a prominent feature of genocide being introduced in the first place, is that the powers that the states that have the power to do anything about this, they are concerned about their own liability for ongoing or past crimes that might be considered genocide. In the United States, obviously, there's slavery and treatment of Native Americans, and depending on how you define it, I imagine there's other things as well. In terms of acting in Ukraine, do you think that the United States is thinking about that, or other nations? Is France thinking about that? Are these concerns that they have?
So a kind of a clean hands concern. I mean, well, look, I don't know exactly what's transpiring in the bowels of the State Department, obviously, right?
Sure.
But we know that the US president did use the term genocide, but we also know that Emmanuel Macron exercised caution in that regard, and he was against that notion. And from my reading of what the international lawyers are saying, they're talking more about war crimes and crimes against humanity rather than genocide. It's my colleagues who are historians, especially Eastern Europe, are more enthusiastic about using the concept of genocide. I understand why. It's because they read Russian and they're looking at Russian politics and social media and seeing a lot of hair-raising genocidal rhetoric, which is undeniably there.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the thing is that for lawyers though, is that just because some official newspaper comes up with a hair-raising article doesn't mean that's evidence for genocide, because to prosecute someone for genocide, you need a particular military officer or someone in a command chain who can be demonstrated to have issued orders or be responsible for subordinates who committed acts which can be shown to be genocide. It becomes very messy and very forensic, in the weeds, Americans like to say, right? Because lawyers are going to be talking about prosecuting particular individuals, whereas my colleagues, these historians, and I think you're interviewing one of them, are seeing, a general genocidal atmosphere, which I think is definitely there. Just definitely there.
Do you think that, is there a way to talk about the type of violence that we're seeing in Ukraine perpetrated by Russian soldiers? Could we simply talk about it in such a way that the global community distributes its attention more equally? Because one of the criticisms that the Russians side raises regularly is that the Americans are so upset about what's happening in Ukraine. In fact, the Foreign Minister Lavrov recently said, just if you're losing sleep, or he had some kind of flippant remark like this, but if you're losing sleep, imagine that instead of Ukraine, it's Palestine or it's Africa, and instead of Russia, it's the United States.
If you cannot sleep because of Russia-Ukrainian conflict, there are some advices to calm you down. First, imagine that this is happening in Africa. Imagine this is happening in the Middle East. Imagine Ukraine is Palestine. Imagine Russia is the United States.
Why? It does seem like the terrible tragedy in Ukraine is more shocking to Western audiences than other conflicts that have also claimed lots of lives. Is that a consequence of the way we speak about it, or is it something deeper in terms of cultural this and that?
Well, you're not going to get me on the record agreeing with Lavrov, okay? Okay, let's make that. Let's let that clear, right? But let me put it this way: quite a few people have noted or observed that there are a number of other conflicts transpiring in the globe today, in Tigray region of Ethiopia, in southern Sudan, and on Yemen, which are not gaining the same attention in the West. Now, whether this is an example of racism or something else is an interesting question to ponder. I would answer it this way: this is taking place in the heart of Europe. And so obviously Europeans are going to be exercised by it. There's a refugee crisis. There's millions of Ukrainians in Poland, Moldova,
Right.
and other parts of East Central, many in Berlin now, where I am.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes without saying that Europeans' attention is fixed there, and I don't think there's anything sinister about that. I mean, that said, the Europeans, especially the Germans, took in, many Syrian refugees, have, and quite generously. I think that's important to say, compared to many other European countries. That they were met ultimately, without the warm greetings that the Ukrainian ones have. But we don't have time to get into that.
Sure.
Now, regarding those other conflicts, well, the West is deeply implicated or parts of the West are deeply implicated in the Yemen one, because Saudi ordnance is purchased from the UK and the US and possibly Germany, though I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that one. And how much have these arms suppliers and their governments done to restrain the Saudis and their coalition partners in basically destroying Yemen? And it's been the largest humanitarian crisis for a long time until recently, and with the massive starvation and so forth. But we don't hear much about it, and I'd like to know why. I mean, this is before the Ukraine crisis, right? But it's not being seen as a crisis of the West or something that challenges the West in the same way that the Ukraine was. Well, in this case, the West is implicated in it. Mm-hmm. And I do think that difficult questions need to be asked there.
I raised these same concerns with Dr. Veraki. Is there any reluctance that you're aware of on the part of Western states to elevate the crime of aggression to the very top? Are there reasons for Western countries with ongoing military operations elsewhere where civilians are dying and a fairly recent colonial past?
Yeah.
Should they be concerned about charges of wars of aggression also, or?
Yeah, there are two issues here. The first issue is the argument of what about it, as we say.
Sure.
We saw that from the very beginning. The first statement of President Putin was like, don't point the finger at me, because look what you did in 2003 in Iraq. Mm-hmm. Let's start with Iraq, which was an illegal invasion, okay? Full stop.
Yeah.
It cannot be justified under international law.
Right.
Now, I don't buy this whataboutism. I find it very difficult. I acknowledge I'm one of the lawyers. When I teach international law, I teach my students, I say 2003, illegal, stop, no excuses, non-legal,
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the West should learn a bit of the mistake, because now, you give the same arguments, to people like Putin and other people like Erdogan and other authoritarian leaders, and say, don't tell me about international law, because look what you did.
Yeah.
Still, I think the current invasion is more different than what happened in 2003. I think the gravity of the crimes, and we talk about a nuclear power, okay, that makes a reference to nuclear weapons. So the whataboutism is there. Now, when it comes to the crime of aggression, no one liked the crime. No one wanted the crime to be there. Of course, imagine that it took us 70 years to incorporate the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute, when in 1945, 1946, in Nuremberg trial, the Nazis were prosecuted for the crime against peace. Mm-hmm. So we had the crime of aggression already. But at that time, we had what we call victor's justice. Okay, so from one side, you have the US, Soviet Union, France, UK, and from the other side, you have the losers. So it was easy for them to have that.
Yeah.
But afterwards, all big powers were very hesitant. They were very afraid about the crime of aggression. The Americans wanted an exception, like that if we use war and force for humanitarian intervention, would that be accepted? And they say no. Okay. So it's a joke. You have a crime in 1945, but you cannot incorporate until 2017 and later, to be activated years later.
Yeah.
Now, this proposal for a special tribunal has been criticized that it's a kind of similar to Nuremberg. It's again victor's justice. So why should we do a particular tribunal just for Russia? Mm-hmm. And why didn't we do something in 2003? Well, in 2003, to put simply like that, the crime was not activated. We didn't have it in the Rome Statute. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't see anyone, to say, oh, let's do a special tribunal for aggression, for the UK and Britain, UK, US, and Australia, and all the coalition powers. Okay, we are not. We know how that works.
Yeah.
Having said that, for me, still, I think that the particular aggressive war is something that is very, very exceptional, the way it happened, because what happened here was like that Putin said, Ukraine is a sovereign territory, sovereign state, but it's not for us. Doubted the sovereignty of an independent state. I mean, the Americans and the Brits, and I'm not here to defend 2003. Far from me, I say it's illegal, blah, blah, blah. They tried to find a legal justification, but they didn't say Iraq doesn't exist. It's not like that, okay? And they didn't go there for like something that happened in 2014 in Crimea to annex the territory. That didn't happen.
Right.
So we can talk about that. But I have to say, I see the problematic, but I don't buy it.
Right.
No.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you. Although you're the expert, I'm just the guy talking to you.
No.
But it's difficult, right? Because I mean, we don't know how far the Ukraine invasion will go. It's only just begun, I suppose. So, although hopefully it'll end soon. But at least as far as we know, the number of people the number of civilians who have died in this war is far less than the number of civilians that have died over the last 20 years in Iraq.
Yeah.
And yet in terms of the law, the way that genocide is written and the way that the way that intent is so important, it's the Ukraine invasion that actually seems to qualify for more of these atrocity convictions or designations than, say, the U.S. invasion or the Allied invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure what my point is there. I guess the reason I raise it is I feel like that's part of the frustration that the Russian regime or Russian patriots I sometimes express. I mean, I don't have like an answer for that. It's just the way the law is written, I guess.
Yeah, but also I see your point, but this is something I work a lot. I'm thinking a lot about that. I challenge myself. I teach it. I talk to students. How I'm interviewed, like here. I think there are more. We have to try to address the whole discussion of what aboutism and everything.
Right.
From a broader perspective. I think there are more pieces in the puzzle. Like we cannot see that in an isolated way.
Yeah.
So, for example, you have a regime like a Putin regime, okay, where you have massive propaganda. Okay, you have authoritarianism. People cannot protest. People who protest immediately, either they have to flee or they are in prison. Okay. And then initially I felt I was reading George Orwell. I'm sure you have read 1984, which says peace is war, right?
Yeah.
The signs. So when they were saying this is not war, this is a special military operation, or we don't attack civilians.
Yeah.
We never attack civilians. I mean, even for people like me who I try to see a nuanced, broader picture, challenge myself all the time, I see, hold on. I mean, seriously now, it's like a virtual reality. You cannot say this is not war. You cannot say, we don't attack civilians. You cannot say, oh, everything is about Ukrainian propaganda. I mean, there is propaganda. The first victim of the war is truth. We always know that.
Right.
But there's something here, that it's not like having two states who are in conflict. It's like, it's an ideological battle, to put it simply, underneath as well. And we should try to address all these issues, trying to contextualize. You understand what I mean? Like at this stage, whatever comes from Kremlin, and I'm not saying that all the others, if I can put it like that, they are the guardians of truth. But I'm saying when they say this is not war, I'm sorry, but what is it?
Yeah.
I mean, tell me what it is.
Right.
If this is not war, then what is it? And when you say, oh, the Ukrainians do not exist, they never existed as a nation, like this kind of denial, and I think that's what triggers also this massive reaction.
Yeah.
There is a kind of unanimous, Western reaction.
Yeah.
We have seen that states in Africa. We see some the way they voted before the General Assembly, but we know also the links of Russia, the presence of Russia in the African continent, okay? And then the only countries that fully supported Russia was like Eritrea. I mean, you see that more or less there is a kind of more unanimous reaction than other times.
Yeah.
So I think also for people liberals, I put myself there. I don't like to to put a label, but I do it now,
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to challenge ourselves all the time, but also it's good to say there are limits. There are some red lines that have been massively crossed. And at least in the West, I'm not here to support, we could protest.
Yeah.
I could go into my university and say that what happened, was, and now I'm in London, I say, 2003, illegal invasion.
Right. Nobody arrests you.
Crap.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear anything. I can say that.
Yeah.
That's not possible to say in a Russian university.
Right. Right. The last question I had was about the consequences of pursuing legal avenues here, pursuing designations, pursuing convictions. I mean, obviously, if you have someone in custody and you convict them, you can put them in jail, or if you're in the US, you can execute them, I guess. In terms of these higher level trials, like the universal kind of jurisdiction stuff, is the purpose of holding those trials where, say, you're essentially going against Putin or his administration. Is it symbolic, or can there then be expanded sanctions, or like what's the like? It's I mean, just in terms of like, you're spending taxpayers' money to like pursue these things. Like, what's the payoff?
Yeah. This is a question that goes into the whole foundational theory of justice, of international justice. And by international justice, I'm not talking only about the International Criminal Tribunal or Special International, but I'm talking about domestic trials, with international profile, as you say.
Right.
I mean, if you read today the statement by the Ukrainians, they say it's a symbolic. We want to send a message, that those crimes will not remain unpunished. And it's quite unprecedented what happens. It's an ongoing conflict, and they start a trial when the conflict is still ongoing.
Yeah.
Now, I will try to be very brief and very precise, which is very difficult.
Okay.
There are many purposes behind the trial. Okay. A trial can adjudicate, can attribute, responsibility. First of all, you want to acknowledge that someone is responsible, individual accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Then, it's a kind of acknowledging, what happened. It's redress for the victims and for the relatives of the victims. They need an acknowledgement, and they need retribution, that the person, who committed something, has to pay some price for that.
Right.
But then we go broader to other issues. We talk about the expressiveness of these trials, that they convey a message that those atrocities cannot remain unpunished, that they are not socially acceptable,
right,
and morally acceptable in the 21st century. Then there are other considerations about deterrence. I'm not that sure about deterrence of those trials. To be honest, I don't think that we cannot prove the causality, the causation between trial and deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
I have my doubts about deterrence, frankly speaking, because we have all these tribunals and still we have seen atrocities.
Mm-hmm.
However, maybe, there is some amount of deterrence. Who knows? And then, you create a historical record as well that cannot be doubted, and that's very important, especially when you see so much propaganda, fake news, distorted reality, another reality. You need to set up a record, that this happens. Because if you hear that this is not war and that people have not been killed, and you need to, it's important, it's a historical record. And that was what happened in Nuremberg already, when there is a characteristic scene from the Nuremberg trial where there is a documentary they show in the Nuremberg, inside the courtroom. And it's shocking because that was actually recorded by the Soviets when they liberated Auschwitz. It was the first time that the public and the people show reality. So more than 70 years later, we have social media, we have internet, we have technology, setting a record straight is very important. So I would say that this is the case. Don't expect that everybody will be trialed. Very few people will be tried. Very few people. I know the critique against those trials are very expensive because we're talking about very serious crimes. You need forensic experts. We need lots of money. But we live in the 21st century.
You've been listening to the Naked Pravda, an English language podcast from Meduza. On today's show, we discussed Russian atrocities committed against Ukrainians in the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. You heard from 4 experts on genocide: Eugene Finkel, an associate professor of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and the author of the book Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust; Aaron Farrell Rosenberg, an adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati's College of Law and an attorney specializing in international criminal law and reparations. Dirk Moses, a professor of global human rights history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the author of The Problems of Genocide and the senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. And Dr. Maria Verrocchi, a lecturer in international law at the War Studies Department, King's College London, and the co-director of the War Crimes Research Group. The Naked Pravda is a podcast from Meduza. It's our only English language show, and I hope you'll recommend us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Or wherever you're tuning in, it does help put this program in front of more people. Talk to the algorithm. Also, if you value Meduza's reporting, whether in English or in Russian or both, please consider making a donation at supportmeduza.io to help sustain our work. Recurring pledges help the most, but we'll take whatever you can spare. Thank you for listening, and come back soon.